Cool. So one of the first big questions that I have to ask you, Dominique, is United or City?
Oh, football. It's probably one of the things I'm least interested in. I'm not gonna lie, but I think growing up we were always Man City. I don't even watch football, but if I had to choose, it'd probably be Man City. Yeah, I used to live in Moss Side when I was growing up in
Okay.
Manchester, and the stadium used to actually be like opposite where I live. I think one of their football clubs, but it moved ages ago.
Okay. So the football fever didn't catch on for you,
No.
though you do choose blue, so a true blue. So politically and football, I like it. Um, so yeah, I think yeah, you're a really interesting voice. I think I'm very excited by young people who take an interest in politics, and I think it goes against this narrative of young people being disillusioned and not caring about politics. I also think it's really interesting and important that we have black conservative voices. I think that's important, and I think in a lot of ways that represents progress in a lot of ways, actually, because I don't think that, there's a lot of people have often seen groups of people as monolithic, and I think it's so important that there's diversity of thought in each group. So it'd be really
Yeah.
interesting to hear a little bit about your journey into subscribing to conservative philosophy and how that came about.
Well, basically, I think it started in college really, because beforehand I didn't know anything about politics at all. I was always more interested in history in high school, and as I like was reading more and learning more about the Weimar Republic, Germany with the
Mm,
rise of Hitler and how their political system worked, I began to actually kind of become interested in parliamentary systems, political systems, and also I felt like having knowledge of politics and how our systems work would be essential for me in kind of my learning and going to university and just life in general. So I picked politics at college. And then from there, I just began to learn more about how our systems work. But at that time, I didn't really know anything about where I leaned politically. So I think I was more so on the left, or so I thought I was, because my teacher, she wasn't overtly left wing, like she didn't try and force anything on us, but there clearly was a bias there. So, for example, she recommended we read the book Chavs by Owen Jones, and I actually went and read that, and then I was like, oh my god, Margaret Thatcher was the devil, all of this stuff, and I was kind of indoctrinated in that way. And then we began to learn more about philosophy, and it was liberalism, socialism, and conservatism. I've never been interested really in socialism, to be honest, which is interesting because I did actually, when I wanted to find a political home, I actually did join the Labour Party for a bit. And it was as I was learning more about conservative philosophy, things like the organic society in particular was something that I really liked. I began to learn more about people like Edmund Burke and things like that. And I began to realize that those ideas to me made the most sense in comparison to liberalism. I felt like liberalism I feel like liberalism puts a bit too much faith, I think, in the individual and kind of assumes that we're innately rational, when I don't really believe we are. I think we're flawed and we're imperfect, which is what conservative philosophy purports. And then there's socialism, which I think is, innately against kind of human nature in a way that it wrongly assumes we're a collective in a bit too much of an absolute way. And I think that's why socialism, in a lot of ways, has led to political oppression and so many deaths. So that's kind of how I realised that I was a conservative. And at first, I was kind of ashamed of it because I didn't want to think that I was a conservative or a Tory or anything like that. Because at my age, it's not really normal to be a conservative or a Tory. But I came to terms with it, and by the time I went to university, I joined a Tory society at uni, and I began to like be more proud of my views and became more vocal, and here I am, really.
cool. Yeah, that's really interesting. And it's interesting you bring up the human nature stuff as well. That is, I think, at the core of both philosophies. I recently read a book called "Humankind: A Hopeful History," which is a really interesting alternative take on human nature, and it tried to actually kind of looking at history and actually looking at some of the examples where human nature has actually been positive and shown acts of kindness. And I think I find it very interesting that, yeah, it's kind of like liberalism and conservatism. It's, you know, I think you can sort of take it back to Thomas Hobbes and Rousseau on the other side, right? And it's like,
definitely.
you know, Rousseau thinks that civilization is oppressive and actually what makes humans go mad, whereas Hobbes will kind of argue that humans need civilization to stop them going mad, essentially. And that's not the best historically summed up way of saying it, but yeah, I don't know. Do you think, because I think, is there not a bit of an absolutism in thinking that this is an either or situation? Do you not think there's a bit of a middle ground maybe?
Oh, yeah, I definitely do think so. So, like, as a kind of Burkean-esque conservative, I do believe that there is a place for community, and I do believe that there are some rational elements of humankind. But I think that a lot of the problems that we see today are as a result of the kind of absolutist, we're, innately rational human beings philosophy that liberalism kind of purports. And I think a lot of the problems that we see today are as a result of those kinds of assumptions. So, for example, the immigration debate and the kind of multiculturalism debate, it's assumed that different cultures can just live together, and then there doesn't have to be any kind of regulation of that, or kind of a taken into account of culture and the differences between different cultures. And I think some of the tensions that we see in this country are as a result of those kinds of assumptions. And as we see now, we're more divided than ever, when really our country has been kind of dominated by the liberal kind of philosophy that we have now. Yet we're more divided than ever. And I think that kind of speaks volumes to how successful this kind of ideology has been and is.
Mm. Do you think we've been dominated by the liberal kind of thought, despite having the conservatives in government for a while now?
Oh, yeah. The conservatives are dominated by a certain type of conservative, and they're not like philosophical conservatives. They're more Thatcherite, free market neoliberals. And that's not the same as being conservative, because there are elements of liberalism and elements of conservatism that just don't go together at all. And that's why Orthodox Conservatives, the organisation that I'm director of communications for, that's why we're kind of so controversial on the conservative scene, because they see us as regressive and they see themselves as progressive, when in actuality we see them as liberals and we see ourselves as the actual conservative. So that kind of dichotomy is really interesting.
Right, that's really interesting, and because I think people can often forget that there is a diversity of thought within political parties themselves, right? And I think
Defo, yeah.
and I think that's quite an important thing to acknowledge. In the same way as I think it's important to acknowledge the same with left wing people as well. And I do worry that actually a lot of the time this divisiveness comes from reducing everything to this essentialist outlook on life. Like, you are either left wing or you are right wing, and if you are one or the other, I'm completely going to disagree with you. I just don't feel that it needs to be like that.
No, it really doesn't. And I think that this problem has just grown and grown and grown. And I think that's why I've moved further away from the left, because I feel like it's very monolithic in the way that it expects people to think, particularly black people. And I think, that in itself is racist, because if black people kind of demonstrate that they actually maybe don't believe in systematic racism to the extent that the left purport, or maybe don't think that, black people can only have socialism to survive and be successful, we're immediately written off as indoctrinated, brainwashed, we hate ourselves, we're coons, and stuff like that. And I think it's that kind of vitriol that I've received that's made me realise that, that left wingers a lot of the time aren't actually very kind people, and neither are progressives. And I don't want to, paint them all with one brush and make out like they're all the same. But a lot of the time, they're actually not very kind when they're faced with people that don't agree with them, especially black people. They really don't like it when black people don't agree with them. all sorts of patronizing stuff comes out. And it just demonstrates that, the kind of anti-racism that we see today, in my opinion, I think is taking on a new form of racism that's actually, I think, more dangerous than what we have experienced in the past. In terms of the kind of racism that we experienced in the past isn't as prevalent as it is today. Yet this new kind of left-wing orthodoxy that kind of says you have to think this way if you're black, you have to think this way if you're Asian, if you're white you should automatically feel guilty for being white. And I think it's that kind of attitude and tone that we see today that is the most dangerous to minorities in 2020, I believe.
Yeah, no, I think you're definitely onto something there. I think it's pretty disgraceful actually when black people call each other Uncle Toms and Coons. And I think, yeah, you shouldn't have to deal with that, particularly because it's the opposite. It's like it's what you're doing is you're using racial slurs against people of your own race, and it's crazy.
It literally makes no sense. And the funny thing is though, the people that say those things, a lot of the time they wouldn't really be able to debate with me. I've done this. I did it a few weeks ago with. They were very friendly, but they were very on the left, and they had this impression of me that I was like trolling black people and like using white people to bash black people or whatever. When we actually got down to the issues and the statistics and the facts, they didn't seem to really have any. And a lot of the time when we were actually having a discussion, they seemed to agree with a lot of the things they were saying that I was saying. They just didn't like who I was saying it to and how I say it. So I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, and I think, and as you can see that the media dominates a lot of the narrative, and the media does kind of subscribe to this sort of leftist, you can only think one way about race and gender, and I do find that a bit intimidating. I think it is a danger in a lot of ways. I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on the current Black Lives Matter wave. I know there's a lot to unpack, but it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts.
Well, where to start? I think Black Lives Matter as a slogan was taken and it was used to push this really divisive and toxic political message. And I think that a lot of people that don't know anything really about the organization or have just heard the slogan and think, yeah, I can get on board with that. I think a lot of people have supported Black Lives Matter for that reason. But what I found interesting was particularly with the Premier League, who obviously took the knee before a game a few weeks ago. What I found interesting, they've recently kind of backpedaled on that support and were saying, no, we support the slogan, not the actual organisation. Despite the fact that, the slogan inevitably comes with very political connotations. So, for example, dismantling the nuclear family, promoting, LGBT within the black community, dismantling capitalism, defunding the police, all of these things are not helpful to the black community. And particularly when I mentioned the LGBT thing, I was called homophobic by a lot of people. What I mean by that is one of the main issues in the black community, both in the US and in the UK, is that there are too many fatherless households. In the UK, it's actually 24% of single parent households are headed by black single mothers, and I think in the US that number like is even higher. And single motherhood, fatherless households, they're linked to a number of issues that disproportionately impact black children. So, for example, you're more likely to be excluded, you're more likely to engage in crime, you're more likely to go to prison. All of these things are because there is not a mother and a father in the home for enough black children, and that's where a lot of these issues are coming from. So why then am I going to support an organisation that wants to dismantle the nuclear family and calls it Western prescribed, when in actuality children are supposed to biologically have a mother and a father? Like, why would I support that? Why would I support the LGBT kind of promotion within the black community when being gay, being trans are very different from being black? And in actual fact, a lot of gay people don't, are quite racist towards black people and black issues. So there's a very, it's very annoying when those issues are conflated, and then I'm expected to sing this tune and if I don't sing this tune, I'm a coon. Like, for me, it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I hear you. I hear you. And funnily enough, they're still doing the kneeling in the Premier League. It's for me. I think I did feel it was a little bit over the top, and I think what's suspicious about it is that, as you say, there is a. It's not clear. There is a conflation between the slogan and an organisation, and also when you do a little bit of digging, it's very we don't. It's hard to even figure out what the organisation is, and then there is a. I think there's a corporation registered under the name, and it gets all
Yeah,
money donated.
yeah, that's I wanted to mention, yeah, that as well. The fact that if you actually go on their website and see where their donations are going, if you go on Act Blue, where all of it's listed, you can see that in America they're actually funding Democratic candidates. So one, this is overtly political, and two, I didn't get to mention this before, it is a Marxist movement and organization. One of the founders referred to herself and the people that work with it as trained Marxists. On the UK Black Lives Matter Twitter account a few weeks ago, they were using the term comrade, and we all know what that means. It's Marxism, it's leftism, and also the fact that they were talking about Palestine. What does Palestine have to do with black people?
Yeah.
Like,
So
it's about everything but black people, and this is what is like so like infuriating to me.
yeah. So I'll just wheel up because there's a few things to unpack there, and I think the Marxism thing is very interesting. Firstly, it's like, okay, I do understand why people from oppressed groups like to band together and like to see the commonalities between each struggle, and I do,
Yeah,
and I think that's perhaps what some of that actually is. But I do also have the same questions as you, as if this is truly about helping black people, and not just black people in the West, by the way. We've got a whole bunch of people
yeah.
outside of our comfy Western countries that need a lot of help. You do have to question why are so many things attached into it. Black trans lives matter, and it does get confusing. I just wanted to quickly as well, just on what you said before, is just in case people misconstrue you suggesting that obviously two parents are very important, a mother and a father, but I imagine you don't mean that it's not okay for there to be, obviously in a gay relationship you could have two mothers and two fathers. Like I think two parents is a key thing, right? Even if
The, the
even if they're gay.
yeah, yeah. I mean, a lot of people were attacking me over this. The idea, I'm not gonna break any bones about it. The ideal is a mother and a father because that's what you need to make a kid. Like, I'm not really ashamed of saying that because it's just the truth, and I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. That is the ideal. If two same-sex parents want to look after a child that's been adopted or anything like that, I don't think it's any of my business to say that they can't do that, because at the end of the day, that child might be happier in that home, regardless of the sex of the two people that are looking at them. And I've seen examples of this where this gay couple were taking in kids from foster homes that were like emotionally damaged. They lived on this lovely little farm, and they were obviously really happy together. So I don't think that's any of my business necessarily. But obviously, the ideal is a mother and a father. And also, this is not to say that being a single parent is bad, because I was raised by a single parent. What I'm saying, and my mum's amazing, by the way, and she's extremely strong, and I respect everything that she's done for me. However, not everyone has been as lucky as me to have a parent that can support me and be both the mother and the father and all of the other family members and support us financially in that way. Not everyone is that lucky, and most people actually aren't, which is what the statistics suggest, and that's why I'm pointing that out.
Cool. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. On the cultural Marxism stuff, I think it's interesting. Now, I'm no Marx scholar, but essentially, I do get a little bit confused when I see all the hatred thrown at Marxism, when it's like I do get that there's a lot of hypocrisy. Like, a lot of us take for granted what capitalism has provided for us, but I don't think everything Marx said was completely crazy and illogical. And obviously, the idea of there being friction between the classes and a need for, you know, working class people to be supported and whatever in a system where people do fall the cracks seems to make sense. I do see what you're saying when political ideologies start hijacking a movement that's supposed to be about empowering Black people.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends. I mean, what exactly do you agree with that Marx said? Was it just the class struggle, or what is it that you think that isn't that bad?
Bad territory for me. I'm not an expert on Marxism, but from what I know, it's the idea of I can respect anyone who acknowledges that there is deep inequalities in society and that there needs to be a unit, that we have to learn to address the inequalities between rich and poor in a variety of innovative ways, and that we shouldn't diminish certain ideologies just because they've been implemented poorly in certain countries. For example, like I know that, you know, like Cuba and China and Maoism and communist Russia and stuff are often used as an example of the failings of that kind of ideology. But, you know, there are plenty of Western countries that have a lot of shortcomings and failings. So I just, it'd be interesting to hear you clear that up a little bit.
Yeah, I think I do disagree there, because Marx has been the specific motivation of those regimes. So, for example, Stalin, he was inspired directly by Marx and kind of wanted to enact that Marxist communism in Russia, and it ended up with, you know, atrocities, gulags, and millions of people dead. And then there was Mao, who felt as though he was the true communist and, you know, a true follower of Marx, and kind of, I think he actually was very divided with Soviet Russia on that point, because he felt like his kind of his kind of aim was more in the image of Marx and more in the image of communism than Soviet Russia. Marx has motivated some really murderous and oppressive ideas, and I think if you read the Communist Manifesto, you know, it's specifically about abolishing any kind of ownership. It's specifically about collectivism, and, you know, the only thing that, you know, people should have is ownership of the means of production. And I think that that creates a really big issue when it comes to, you know, people being rewarded for their talents and for their abilities. And I think that's something that Marx kind of really disregards, because, yeah, the workers should be treated fairly. And I think that that's something everyone, if not most people, can agree on. But it's just the way in which you think that that should come about. Should workers be paid the same as someone who has, you know, taken the risk in setting up a business, has the responsibility of making sure people's wages are paid, at the same time making sure their business can run efficiently and be successful? I don't think so. I think one person is taking a risk to set up a business, and I think another person has looked for employment and that has been provided. So I think my issue with Marx is he looks at things way too generally and doesn't take into account the work that goes into actually being an employer and being, you know, the bourgeoisie or whatever.
Mm. Well, he's not with us anymore to defend himself, unfortunately. But yeah, I think, yeah, it's a very interesting conversation. I mean, when you mention people like Stalin and Mao, whatever, I just think of them as they're just crazy, despotic, power-hungry human beings that whatever ideology they subscribe to, they would have been crazy and power crazy. But
yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah, and yeah, I guess it's interesting as well to hear maybe how you see a way out of a system that has created billionaires and homeless, and, you know, and mass homelessness, you know, like where's the way out of that through the current capitalist ideologies?
Yeah, and I see what you mean there. I think capitalism in its kind of raw form is the most desirable, you know, that in which you receive a payment for a service, and it kind of goes in that way. You know, you provide a service, you get paid for it, vice versa. I think what capitalism has kind of morphed into is corporatism. And I don't think I'm a fan of corporatism because I think that it creates a monopolies which actually stifle the competition that capitalism actually seeks to create. And in that, we do see the creation of billionaires. For example, I think Jeff Bezos was just like who's like the richest man in the world or something like that. Can't really remember. Um, I do think that is kind of problematic when we have people that are starving in the streets, people that can't afford to feed themselves, people that can't afford to put a roof over their head. I do think that is problematic, but I don't think the issue is capitalism in itself. I think it's crony capitalism and corporatism that sprung out of this, which actually stifles the competition. How we kind of fix that, I'm not sure. I think yeah, I'm not sure. That question I think is a bit of a deep one because I think that it's slowly as globalism has kind of been introduced, this kind of corporate world of, you know, mass wealth has just sprang really gradually in a way that nobody's really noticed. So I don't know, that question is something that I'd have to think about.
Mm. I can safely say I have no idea either. I'm sure people smarter than me will figure it out.
Yeah, same.
Um, I thought one thing that's been very interesting as well through this whole Black Lives Matter wave is a reevaluation of history. And I saw, you know, you're I'm sure you're proud of Black history and whatever.
Yeah.
But obviously the conversation around statues has been very interesting. And obviously we saw Colston statue taken down in Bristol, and that sparked off a lot of other stuff. How do you kind of feel about the general attitude towards statues and history? Are you a fan of Churchill, or are you mixed feelings about him, or?
I'd say I'm more of a fan than not. And I think it's because you know, Churchill was a man of his time. And I wouldn't say that was an excuse for being racist, but at the time, you know, most people thought that way about people of different races. And I choose to look at what Churchill did as a leader for this country in the war, defeating the Nazis. And I think we also forget that there were black people living in Germany at that time who were mistreated, specifically mixed race people that were actually sterilized and to stop them from breeding with white Germans, as well as you know the way Jews were treated as well. So I think people often do forget that there were actually black people and mixed race people living in Germany at that time who were also at risk from Hitler. And you know, I think you just have to think of the alternative. The people that bash not Hitler, Churchill, and want statues of him removed and everything like that. I think they forget that there was a worse alternative that would have not only sought to seek to exterminate black people, but also the entire Jewish race. Which one would you prefer? And I think we have to remember that, and we have to remember that the reason we are here today is because of Churchill. No leader is perfect, and everybody has their flaws. Martin Luther King had his flaws, and you know he's resting in heaven right now, but he was, you know, someone that inspired so much positive change. But even he was a flawed character. And I think that when we judge people by today's standards, we run a real risk of erasing any part of history that we don't like altogether, and that's dangerous. And I think it's really kind of 1984-esque Orwellian kind of stuff that he predicted. And I think we're going down that road, and it's quite scary.
Mm. Do you think there needs to be any, because I think part of the issue, right, is that, not disagreeing with anything you've just said, but it's like a lot of people are only taught about the positive things Churchill did and know nothing about the racism and the more negative things. So is it a matter of just teaching a more wide spanning global history?
I think so. My problem with the way history is taught is I think it's taught very one-sided. So I think that black people are often portrayed as perpetual victims, specifically where slavery and colonialism is concerned. We don't learn about the fact that there were like 300 black people in the UK throughout the Tudor period. We don't learn about that, and we also don't learn that slavery as a phenomenon is one that wasn't just inflicted upon black people. Slavery was something that loads of cultures practiced, including black cultures. And I think that it reinforces, in a lot of ways, low self esteem within black people when we're constantly depicted as victims, and white people are constantly depicted either as the victors of history or our oppressors. With regards to showing history in a more wider span, I think we should do that. But I think the people that want to go over the empire and colonialism, I think their aims are more to reinforce discomfort and resentment within black people than it is to kind of show a fair representation of history. So I'm very skeptical of people like Jeremy Corbyn who have called for these kinds of things. And I think we should be kind of careful where that is concerned.
Yeah, I think those are interesting points. I personally, on my own journey looking into history, I got very tired of the slavery narrative because it is all based on victimhood. Slavery has been something that has plagued all peoples going back into history, but at the same time, I do acknowledge that the transatlantic slave trade was pretty uniquely
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, and
It was, yeah, it was uniquely atrocious. I don't think, anyone can doubt that. But what I would like to do is, demonstrate that there were black people in Britain that fought their own freedom. For example, Ignatius Sancho, who was the first black man to vote. I think this was in 1730 and then again in 1780. Like, there's a wide history of black people in Britain, so why do we always want to depict black people as victims and slaves? Like, I don't see what that achieves. And I think if we showed history in a more kind of honest but also positive light where black people are concerned, we'd see less black people feeling like they don't belong in this country or that white people hate them. And you'd see less black kids having low self-esteem and feeling resentment towards white people because of how our history is kind of framed, I'd say.
yeah, totally. And you can even look outside of Britain and pre-slavery, pre-transatlantic slavery in Africa, there were kingdoms, and there's a famous figure called Mansa Musa who's actually described as one of the richest people who ever lived. So it's very fascinating that the narrative has been narrowed to slavery in our curriculum. But
yeah, he was actually the richest king in history.
Yeah.
Like, he was a very wealthy man. Did he have slaves and people that were, treated badly under him? Probably, because that is a feature of history. But we struggle to ever want to depict black people as victors or people that, had a culture before slavery or had wealth before slavery. And I think that is what has contributed to a lot of the attitudes we even see today.
Totally. I really like, because you are fearless in how you address this regressive leftist narrative. I'm slightly less fearless, but I'm getting there. So I think we are definitely seeing a wave of identity politics take over sort of culture in a strange way, and I tiptoe around it because, like, I have to acknowledge that there is positives in identity politics, and I think people often reduce it to minorities, whereas quite arguably there's white identity politics as well. So I just think nuance is often the answer for a lot of these things. But what are perhaps some of the most concerning things you're seeing? I know for me, when I see things like Little Britain getting taken off Netflix, whatever, I'm just like, it seems crazy to me because it's so obviously an example of virtue signaling.
Yeah, exactly. And it just makes you think, like, what do these liberals and these, like, anti-racist people, what do you actually think of black people? Like, you really have to ask that question. Do you think that we can't take a joke? Because, like, one of the funniest people going, like, Little Britain depicted every single race of people in a funny and satirical way. Like, white working class people, Asian people, black people. It was designed to be offensive. And for them to assume that we'd be so offended that we can't even, have Little Britain on TV anymore, I just think it's a bit insulting, because there are wider issues that we can talk about that impact Black people more immediately. But no, the left want to focus on removing TV shows and statues. I just think I think we have our priorities just really jumbled up, and I think a lot of the time Black people are often seen as too fragile to be able to view things that might upset us. And I think Gone with the Wind was also removed as well. And the Black woman that was actually in that, she was the first Black woman to actually win an Oscar. So you're erasing a bit of Black history because you think people today might be a bit offended. History is history. You can't just erase things that you don't like. And I think, the fact that I think her name was Gloria Davis or something like that. The fact that she was the first Black woman to win an Oscar, I think that is a very important part of Black history. Yeah, it's predominantly those on the left that want to remove that because it might be offensive to some people today. I just think it's ridiculous, personally.
Yeah, and I think it's very undermining of the fact that that happened at a specific time. I think even if, for whatever reason, our modern day morals or whatever deem that offensive, it's like, how is erasing it doing anything positive? I mean, if anything, let it be, because it's a clear indicator of what used to be acceptable. So I don't.
Yeah, so we can learn. So we can learn from it, but they don't want to learn from anything. They want to erase everything so they can, construct their own worldview. And this is what's dangerous about leftist thinking, because there seems to be a trend, and this trend has been throughout history, of them just removing things and tearing things down that don't match their worldview, and then constructing their own to try and brainwash everybody. And I think that's why it's so dangerous to the public discourse. Because I don't know if you've noticed, but this hasn't. I don't think, for the most part, this has actually furthered the debate. I think that it's created a lot more division and a lot more resentment between Black people and white people. When, for the most part, I can say I think Black people and white people in this country largely live in harmony. I feel like this rhetoric that is often thrown at us all the time is that Black people and white people don't get on because white people are just so racist towards Black people all the time. And, everything's racist and this country's racist and white people hate Black people in this country. And, I'm suspicious of why they want us to believe that.
Mm.
And I think it's mostly for a political gain.
Yeah, totally. Do you ever wonder if I saw, it was really interesting. I think Candace Owens was interviewing Jocko Willock, and it was really interesting because he kind of had posed a question to her, suggesting that he doesn't see the same cultural Marxism or identity politics, whatever you want to call it, in his day to day. So I just kind of, I guess I want to ask you the question of, to what extent do you think all of this stuff is actually something that's happening like in an online space and through the media and in universities, as opposed to like people who just live their normal day to day? I sometimes wonder if there's a risk of getting triggered by stuff that just happens to trend on Twitter, whereas like your everyday geezer down the road doesn't give a shit. Do you know what I mean? It's just his life.
Yeah, I think that's why we see like such a dichotomy between the current political discourse, cultural discourse, I'd say, outside the traditional kind of party political realm. That's why we see such a dichotomy between the two, because we currently have the Conservatives in power who have an 80-seat majority or won an 80-seat majority. Yet, at the moment, if you judge by what we saw in the media and on Twitter, you'd think that Labour had just won a landslide majority, and there was a cultural, Marxist revolution happening right now in this country. When in reality, like day to day, nobody really cares or thinks about this stuff. But because our country is seemingly governed by social media now and governed by Twitter, this narrative is just being like thrown at us continuously by your Sky News, by your Channel 4. Now it's in schools as well, it's in universities too. And it creates this kind of bubble of academia, which actually isn't very reflective of what's going on in the country right now and how people in the country actually feel. But I think we should also be afraid of this, though, and we should call this out, because the people that are vulnerable to this kind of identity politics propaganda are young people, and they're our future lawyers, they're our future politicians, they're our future teachers. They're the people that we're passing the baton to for the next generation of our society. And I think that's why it's so important that we nip this in the bud now. How, successful conservatives are right now in actually addressing it and nipping that in the bud, I think is a really big question. I personally don't think that conservatives have been very successful with regards to the kind of cultural change that is happening in this country right now. But I think it's also inspiring more and more people to speak out against it. So it's kind of something that we'll just have to wait and see for.
Where are you worried that it might end up or might lead to?
I think I think it's going to lead to a society which is basically like 1984, like what George Orwell depicted, where there can't be any dissenting views, where our language is policed, in the sense that, the words that we use don't even have any meaning anymore. They don't really make sense, but we're told that words mean something different than they actually do. So, for example, the trans debate, where we're constantly being forced to say that men are women, or that men can get periods, when we all know that they can't. But because they're changing the definition and meaning of so many words, we're forced to say things that actually don't make sense. If you actually think about it, it doesn't make sense. And this is where it's going. And anyone that kind of dissents from this nonsensical political discourse is vilified, has to lose their job, is silenced, is removed from social media. And we're seeing it right now, but slowly and slowly it's becoming more acceptable. And I think we're just going to be in a position where free speech just doesn't exist. And I just think it's really scary.
Yeah, yeah. And I completely, I share those fears. I do, I do find the trans one an awkward one as well, because it's like, look, like I know, look, neither of us are identify as trans, so there's only so much we can speak on it. But
Yeah.
one point I did just want to raise, because I think it's crazy, people losing their jobs over, saying there's two biological sexes and whatnot. For sure, that stuff does seem a bit wild. But I also wonder and empathize for those trans people who actually don't like the narrative that's being dominated on Twitter, because I'm sure in the same way that as a black person we might not like the dominating narrative around black people or Black Lives Matter or whatever.
Definitely.
I'm sure there's people who are just not vibing with what's representing them. One thing I did just want to mention on that, because I know you've been quite vocal on the whole trans thing, I just wondered, I know the science doesn't quite make sense to us today with the trans thing, but one thing I kind of wanted to compare it to back when black people were deemed inferior biologically, right? And eugenics science was mainstream. It was almost like a mainstream view to believe that black people were inferior.
Mm-hmm.
Do you ever wonder that actually it's just a matter of we haven't figured out the science behind the whole trans stuff yet? So do you ever like wonder that actually maybe we shouldn't be kind of radically saying one thing or another about trans if we don't fully understand the full picture of what trans even means,
Well, there actually is some science behind it, and I actually looked at a study, and it was studying the brain, and it actually, I'm trying to word this in like a scientific way because I've looked at this ages ago, but in areas of the brain where in areas of the brain that would light up if you were a woman, it was the same for a trans person who felt as though they were a woman. So their brain patterning was similar to that as a woman. And I think that reinforces the fact really that gender dysphoria is a mental development. And I think it was removed as a mental illness by the World Health Organization. But gender dysphoria is kind of a mental issue that kind of takes form when you physically believe that you are in the wrong body. It's scientifically impossible to be in the wrong body. And also, I think this kind of speaks to people who believe in God as well, because people who believe in God believe that, God doesn't make mistakes in that way. So I don't believe that you can physically be born in the wrong body. It is a mental issue. I do think that we should be more accepting of people that actually have those issues, but I don't think there's any science that would ever back up men being able to get periods, men being able to have babies, and men being born in the wrong body and being actually women. Because I think that this is actually insulting to biological women as well, because it assumes that being a woman can just be whittled down to a feeling. And being a woman isn't just something you feel. Being a woman is something that you are. It's being able to birth children. It's your hormones. It's periods. Sorry to get graphic here, but it's breastfeeding. It's all about, we're designed to bear children, and we're designed to be women, and men are designed to be men. And I think that this is also exemplified in the way that, you know, men that identify as women are dominating this debate, because men are naturally more dominant than women. It's the way men were designed to be, and this debate is predominantly being dominated by men that identify as women, that are trying to force themselves into female spaces. I think it's like 74% of people that identify as trans are actually men that identify as women, and the vast majority of those people actually still have male genitalia. So when we, you know, when we think about these issues, we have to be mindful of, you know, how is this actually insulting to women and the sex-based rights that women have, you know, fought for generations. Being a woman isn't just a feeling, and I think it's really insulting that some people try and suggest that, in my opinion, because it's the vast majority of the time it's women that this is actually affecting. It's not men. When we think about trans men, they comprise very little of the trans debate and the trans movement and people that actually identify as trans. When we look at you know, unisex bathrooms and genderless bathrooms, this is going to disproportionately affect biological women, because, you know, trans people comprise like less than 1% of the population, and the vast majority of people that identify as trans are actually biological men. So I think people forget this side of the debate and often think about it in more of, oh, we have to be kind to everyone, we have to think about emotion all of the time, when we have to actually look at the facts and how this actually impacts women. And I think that's why I'm so kind of strong when it comes to this topic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you have every right to be. I think I would just hope that there's space for a wider conversation about gender, because I spoke to a very interesting professor not too long ago, and he's done a lot of work on radical feminism, and it's really interesting how there is that big rift between sort of radical feminists and the trans thing. And it's quite interesting because he says he didn't like being referred to as cisgender because he doesn't actually subscribe to kind of society's gender norms. As a man, he doesn't like to fit into the whole macho aggression type man stereotype.
But why does this have to be whittled down to cis, trans, and non-binary? Why can't you just be you? I don't understand it. If we can accept that not everyone subscribes to like traditional gender norms. I mean, I don't subscribe to the traditional view of how a woman should be, in the sense that I am very independent. I am quite dominant as a woman, even though like normally men are actually naturally more dominant than women. But I don't subscribe to that kind of traditional thing, because that just isn't the way I am. But that doesn't mean that I'm gonna try and erase the norm and say that no, in actual fact, men are the same as women, because I'm not a traditional woman, so that means nobody is. And I think it's just annoying. Why can't you just accept that everybody's a bit different, but that doesn't change what the norm is?
Mm-hmm.
I just find it. I think it's quite arrogant as well at the same time, because, you know, exceptions to the rule are now becoming the new rule. And I just think it's dangerous, because there are differences between men and women. Men and women are not the same. And this whole, the trans debate is kind of making assumptions that we can just feel whatever gender we feel like we are. And I just don't think that's true or founded in biological fact.
Yeah, and I completely understand it's a slippery slope. I feel like I would like to speak to more trans people, or people who identify that way, to learn more. And I don't want to sort of speak for them, but it is very interesting. And I think, yeah, we're we're headed down a strange road. And I wonder like how much of it is just dominated by the crazy social media and the media.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, because I've actually like met quite a few trans people and interacted with quite a few trans people in my lifetime. Um, and I was actually in Paris with my friend, and we were in a gay club because my best friend is gay, and like that's where he likes to go when he's in Paris, so I just go with him. And there was a trans woman there, and we were talking to her, and somehow the kind of issues and the kind of came up, and she again felt like she wasn't being accurately represented, because she felt like the debate was being dominated by extremists. And there's this other great trans woman on Twitter called Rose of Dawn, who addresses those issues as well, because a lot of trans people actually don't feel represented the same way that a lot of gay people don't feel represented by the modern day LGBT movement. My best friend who's gay, he doesn't feel represented by it, and he feels like the LGBT movement as kind of a monolithic block is constantly saying that they're speaking for gay people, when in actual fact a lot of gay people actually don't agree with the kind of things they're saying. So I think, yeah, we do have to be mindful of that and actually remember that.
Totally. Lastly, I'd be really interested to just hear a little bit about your future ambitions and where you might want to go in terms of politics, and as well, if there is anything you like about left-wing ideology.
I think left-wing ideology, when it comes to economics, I know a lot of the time left-wing people are like get the piss taken out of them so much when it comes to the economics and the way they handle the economy. But I would say I'm more of a centrist economically, and I do think there are a few lessons to be learned from kind of the Keynesian style of economics that's often associated with the left. And I also think there are things to be learned from the neoliberal kind of Milton Keynes way of kind of, not Keynes, what am I, Hayek, and all of those kinds of people. I think there are things that we can learn from both sides, and I think that the left can be sometimes more emotionally understanding. I think that sometimes the right can be a bit too little emotionally understanding. So that is kind of what I like about the left. Um, I think where I want to go with my career, um, I think there's so much stuff that I want to do. I'd love to be a presenter one day, like to be able to interview politicians and hold them to account in that way. And one day I would like to go into electoral politics, but I don't want to be like one of those careerist type people that say, I want to be an MP, because usually those are the people that probably shouldn't be MPs. But that would be something that I'd want to do one day, definitely.
Cool. Well, it was amazing to talk to you today. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to me. I feel like I've
No
learned
problem.
a lot, and you might have pushed me slightly from the left to the left of centre. But
Oh,
yeah,
good to hear. Good to
yeah.
hear.
No, like I said before this, yeah, I don't really know where I stand, or if I identify with one or the other. I got a lot of family who are left wing. I think that we're all individuals. I think there's a lot of interesting things to be picked from all sorts of ideologies, and I don't really like the idea of putting myself in one kind of box. But
Never put yourself in a box. Just be you and think the way you want to think, is what I say.
it's important in today's age. I mean, like you say, free speech is under threat, free thought is under threat. So yeah,
Exactly.
I really appreciate your place in all of this, and I hope you don't get too much abuse from these crazy Twitter trolls.
Well, I do get a lot of abuse, but like sometimes it annoys me. When it does, I just put away my phone and don't read the comments. But sometimes I'm in the mood to go back and forth. Just lately, I've not really been in the mood to go back and forth, so I just ignore them.
Good idea. Good idea. All right. Lovely speaking to you. Take care of
Lovely
yourself,
speaking to
and
you.
hopefully we can do this again another time.
All right, speak to you soon.
All right.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.